Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar on Splunk SecOps series, risk-based alerting. I've expanded the title here into risk-based alerting using MITRE ATT&CK and enterprise security. Just to kind of set the scene, so we're going to go through risk-based alerting, how that is used in enterprise security, and how that leverages the MITRE ATT&CK framework. If you have any questions, feel free to fire them into the questions section, and I'll come to them at the end. I'll have a little Q&A right at the end to answer any specific questions about anything that we go over today. There is an understanding that the attendees will have some knowledge of what Splunk Enterprise Security is. If that's not the case, then please join one of our webinars on the introduction to enterprise security, or you can find those sort of things on our YouTube page as well. So Splunk risk-based alerting using MITRE ATT&CK and enterprise security. So what do we actually mean, and why are we even talking about this? So I guess the problem is really around the amount of alerts that hit the modern security operations center. There are just too many, and what that really means and what that really does is the lower priority ones. Yes, we've had priorities, we've had urgencies to be able to deal with, you know, those that are most deemed relevant and known, and but it does mean that a lot of things are abandoned or suppressed. You know, there's repetition, there's a lot of tuning that needs to go in. It also means that because we're dealing with a lot of alerts, anything may get kind of brushed under the carpet or may not be seen. Maybe brush under the carpet is not necessarily the right word, but not necessarily seen, and that can slow the detection, the response process until something else pops up in that kind of run through what's going on. Okay, so you can really get a lot of burnout from your analysts and potentially turnover of your SOC staff, which is obviously really not a good thing. So making the SOC better and more performant really helps on a number of different levels, really. So what can we do? At the moment, obviously, we're hitting alert fatigue. We currently take analytics and then we tune them and say, right, that's a false positive, let's not do that. And that, you know, generally makes it a little bit better in terms of our detections and our controls that we have in place. But really, we can take this to another level, really. And the way that we're going to do that is really is not just reducing the alert volumes, but also improving the security coverage. Okay, so we can take more information in from analytics, and we can leverage that and correlate that with other types of things, all against the MITRE ATT&CK framework or the cyber kill chain or any other sort of framework that we wish to align to, including our own custom ones, and really reduce the amount of noise and really make sure that we've got higher fidelity alerts. And that's really what we're after, is higher fidelity alerts. We know this is bad. We know a lot of more information straight from the off in terms of contextualizing it, in terms of being able to investigate it and have that at our fingertips and get the security operations center to a much more streamlined process. So the concept is called risk-based alerting. It's been around for a while. Risk is obviously a known terminology, a known methodology of how to determine what's going on. And essentially what we do is we take any particular type of event, we class it as an observation. We observe these analytics happening. So that could be a new user being created. That could be, which, you know, previously you would never have even taken as a security event, or that could be indicative of a security incident. Now we can take that in and bring it into a risk index and essentially add a point of risk to that particular thing, that new user or the user that's created that particular new user. And if these sort of things bubble up and accumulate enough risk, then we alert on it because they've done enough things that could be indicative of a security incident. And that's really how it works. So what we do is we assign a risk score to a particular observation. That risk score can be any sort of numerical value. We also align any annotations. We annotate it however we can. So we can do that with the MITRE ATT&CK tactics. We can do that, as I say, with other things such as the cyber kill chain annotation or anything else. And then any particular outliers of particular business policies and all that sort of thing. That's what we're really looking for. Things that shouldn't be happening, or if they are happening, you know, and that could be inside a threat, that could be external, it could be across a whole number of different areas of security focuses that we want to be looking at. And then once we've done that, what we then do is run another set of correlations on that information, and we call these the risk incident rules, and these then generate the alerts. So we've got a separate section now in the middle of analytics to alerts, which is where we accumulate the information, and then we use on top of that additional kind of context to be able to define what our alerts are. And these can be high fidelity alerts. Now, in certain situations, if we see something that is known bad, we can analyze it and say this is definitely ransomware without going into the risk index, without doing anything else. There's still the ability to go straight to the alert and just create a notable alert from it, right? And that should be done in situations where we see something that really shouldn't happen on our environment. So what does this actually look like in practice? So over a course of time, throughout the day, we may see a number of different events that might occur tied to a particular system or tied to a particular user. So we leverage the asset and identity framework to be able to correlate this kind of concepts together. And these individual events might have been considered too noisy in the past, may have been abandoned completely. We may not have run detection rules for them at all. We may have just hoped that we got something later on in the incident that we could pick up and track that someone's actually been there and done something malicious to the business. But effectively, so we have this kind of over time. So now what we do is we have a risk incident rule that kind of tracks that at the end and keeps track of all the things that have been popped into our bucket of information. Observed is the term, right? Everything that's been observed and effectively put into the risk index. This risk incident rule runs on top of that, and if it's got an aggregated risk score of 100 points, then let's alert on it, okay? And this could be over a 24-hour period, so if we see things over a short period, but this risk incident rules can be altered, they can be tuned, much like our previous kind of things, but now we have a slightly different tuning mechanism, but ultimately we still have the ability to tune these down and produce less alerts or produce more alerts or produce alerts based on if weighting of certain tactics are important to us or weighting of certain business units or something like that. We can do all sorts of different things to alter the alert and what we're going to get out at the other end, okay? So this is how it looks in practice, which is great. What does it really do? Well, it reduces alerts, it improves detections where you can bring in more observations, more controls that we want to be detecting upon. We can actually increase the maturity of our SOC by being able to deal with more incidents with better knowledge of that incident even from the start, and essentially that means we can reduce operational costs. So there are big benefits to being able to do an RBA approach to your detections, and I'm going to go into that in just a moment. So just before I touch that, I just want to recap primarily on the ES frameworks, just in case anyone's not aware of how ES kind of works on the call. As I said earlier, do join one of our webinars on Introduction to ES, and we'll go into more detail. But ultimately, there are 5 frameworks that are key to how ES works. There's the Notable Event Framework, which is how we generate alerts. What we call these alerts are called notable events. And again, we leverage this with RBA. We've got the Asset and Identity Framework, which is how we correlate and contextualize all of the information of a particular user or an asset. So if we've got an event that comes in with an IP address and an event that comes in with a host name, we're able to actually say that's the same system. And that's really important when we're trying to correlate and observe and add risk scores to a particular object. We need to know it's the same object that we're adding the risk score to. We've got the threat framework. We've got, of course, the risk framework, and it's been in place in enterprise security for a while, but now we're actually leveraging it at a much more deeper level. And the adaptive response framework, which is how we assign risk, how we create notable events, and how we talk to TrueStar or some other technology that we might want to be talking to. And that all sits within this kind of ES side on the right hand side here. So these particular frameworks, as well as all of the common information, all of the data gathering add-ons, and all the great stuff, the glass tables, swim lanes. So glass tables isn't in there anymore, but the swim lanes, the dynamic threshold, and the key security indicators, timelines, all that sort of stuff. All the great stuff that comes with ES. Good. All right. So risk framework obviously is the RBA piece, so let's go and have an actual look at it. As I said at the beginning of the call, if you do have any questions, just fire them into the questions box or even directly to me in chat, and I will come to them at the end of the webinar. But just a reminder to go ahead and fire those in. So let's have a look. Well, the first thing that I want to take you to is, before we get to ES, is Splunk Security Essentials. Now, again, if you're not completely familiar with how Splunk Security Essentials works, there is a webinar on that, so please join that, or again, look at the YouTube page. I'm going to touch on a few little pieces in here, and really about how we can use Splunk Security Essentials to develop our RBA strategy. And one of the first things, of course, with Splunk Security Essentials is the content, right? So one of the things that you can do, and even from the homepage, is come into content and come into risk-based alerting content. So there are content tags that say that this is risk-based alerting. We then can look a particular area of interest, right? So we can drill that down. Maybe we want to drill down into insider threat. So we've come basically from the homepage, go find content, go risk-based alerting content, click on insider threat, and that's going to basically filter this down the security content page into things that we can be using for risk-based alerting on insider threat that might be interesting, right? So flight risk printing, flight risk web browsing. So we could be using this sort of things from a risk-based alerting approach. And this gives us that kind of collection of use cases, detections that we can be seeing. And as you know, if you click on any of these, you'll get the information about how that search is, how many times we would expect it to alert, how you can run that search within your data set, within that viewpoint, and how you would implement it and how you would necessarily initially respond to it if you did see it. So you get all that kind of good stuff in there. But just as a touch point, I suppose, to start with, is this is a very easy way of developing the strategy or developing the use cases that you might be wanting to use within within Splunk Security Essentials to build into enterprise security. Very important addition to it. Now, what we can also do is, because we're focusing here on the MITRE ATT&CK, we can use the MITRE ATT&CK framework recommendations. So under security content here, you can go to MITRE ATT&CK driven content recommendations. That's going to pop up with essentially again, you can categorize it. So I'm looking here at insider threat. I'm looking at the different total content. So there's over 1,000 detections in total, 37 of which are insider threat. And again, you can see all that content list again from here, but now we're doing it from an attack perspective. And we can see whether we're hitting a certain amount of threat groups for these particular use cases. So they're, they're more likely to be in certain areas that people might be interested in, or domains or industries that you might be interested in, depending on the threat group that might be aligned to it. Which is really good. And again, that's another way of drilling down the information to, again, build that RBA catalog of risk rules, of essentially observations that you want to be looking for, which is really good. So that's one sort of dashboard that I just wanted to point out within Splunk Security Essentials. Another one that I wanted to point out is essentially ES Risk Attributions analyzing. Just wondering why that's kind of grayed out a little bit there. So we'll just come into it again. So security operations, analyze ES risk attributions. So this Splunk Security Essentials is essentially looking at the risk that's being applied in ES. And we're taking the risk objects, we're taking the risk details. Now, this has only been running today, so a lot of this hasn't been populated yet as overnight, but ultimately this dashboard is here to be able to drill down within Splunk Security Essentials on the risk that's been applying. And you can see that's been applying throughout the last sort of certain timeframes. You can see where that's being applied generally, the systems or users that risk is applied to. And again, those analytics risk scores that are applying to these particular objects. So that's just another viewpoint that is related to risk that you'll find potentially interesting in your environment yourself. Now, the other dashboard in Splunk Security Essentials I want to point out is actually the MITRE ATT&CK Framework Analytics Advisor. So under Analytics Advisors, MITRE ATT&CK Framework. Now, this is really about when you want to map what you're doing with RBA against, or even just normal use cases, to be fair, against the MITRE ATT&CK Framework. So how you can then leverage the MITRE ATT&CK Framework with the content that you're doing. So you've got a number of use cases in the system. These use cases you are essentially, and you'll see this in the webinar on Splunk Security Essentials in a little bit more detail, you have a way of bookmarking, essentially tracking that you've implemented particular use cases. And when you've implemented those use cases, you can view them from the MITRE ATT&CK Framework perspective. colored by how much data you've got for how many use cases you've got enabled. So you can color by active, you can color by which is available in different stages of that particular piece, or what you've been bookmarked and interested in. And you can also take the threat group. So this I've taken the industry aviation. There's a lot of different threat groups that you can leverage, APTs particularly, or all this different things. And when you add this threat group, what it's going to do within this image is essentially highlight which areas these threat groups tend to work within against the business, and then you can use that in correlation with the amount, the color, the darkness of your detections to make sure that you've got and you're detecting use cases or making detections that are aligned to what sort of threats you expect to be being attacked under, essentially. So that's a really good way of kind of mapping, visualizing is probably the term, the MITRE attack framework, and making use of it and making sure you're measuring what you're doing in your SOC with those detection rules that are in place. Right, so that's Splunk Security Essentials, just a few little pages. As you know, if you come to my webinars, I tend to always go into Splunk Security Essentials to start with. I've kind of finished that piece. It's such a foundational pillar to Splunk for security. So really important to be able to understand all the different dashboards and pages within that. So now let's just have a look at enterprise security. Now, you'll be familiar with enterprise security's front page, the security posture, hopefully. If you're, again, new to ES, join us for the Intro to ES webinar. I'll go into more details about it. But ultimately, you can have a number of key indicators across the top. Now here, I've actually specifically called out the risk objects that are in play here. I've left the access notables, the network notables, and I've got key KPIs for risk because I'm determining that as being more useful to me right now because I'm looking more on the risk framework. Because I've got a risk strategy and I want to go across that. So we've got a number 22 different risk systems, and these are brand new from yesterday because it's only been running today. So the system's brand new today. So everything's gone up. The full amount wasn't anything yesterday, but they've all gone up. So that's good. So we've got 25 in total, 22 of which are system, 3 of which are users that are we are deeming to be of risk to the business. Using the RBA approach, and we can see the risk rules that are generally actually triggering for that. So we've got the risk indicator rule, 7-day attack tactic threshold exceeded, and the risk threshold exceeded for an object over a 24-hour period. Now, if I click on either of these, or of course anything in here, it will take us to the incident review page. And within the incident review page, you can filter down on the different notables. Now, this is version 7 of ES, and 6.6 had the same view of incident review. Previous versions, if you are familiar, may well have the older version of older view of incident review. Splunk, leveraging RBA, really hit enterprise security at 6.4, version 6.4, but it took off in 6.6 when they built in this kind of new version of the dashboard for incident review. But it's really important to just understand that in terms of the level. So we're on 7 here. So we've got the latest to greatest here. But it is all, what I'm showing you is all out of the box. So, right, so the number of notables. So we've got the risk events. So we've got particular things. So this attack tactic threshold exceeded over the previous 7 days, now 5 order. We can have a look. Their risk scores hit 389 at the point of this being triggered. Their risk events, there's 16. If I click on here, it will show me the actual risk events that are in line to this particular thing. So we've got a lot of geographical and probable accesses going on throughout the day. If I scroll in, I can also see malicious PowerShell processes being run. I can see an unusual volume of outbound activity. So we've got the timeline across the top that we can obviously browse through. And we've got all of those particular contributing risk events down below in terms of the risk score, but you can also filter based on the time. So lots of different observations that have occurred. Now, geographical and probable accesses may not be very high in terms of its confidence, so its risk scores are very low, but it does have those tactic IDs in because that could be of use to us when we do correlation. We might want to know, okay, we've seen them in these sort of areas, that Superman kind of user, but also there's other things that this particular user has been involved in. And we can see all those annotations. And if you expand one of those, you can get more information around it. You can get the threat object that was in play. So this particular, the command for this PowerShell process, the risk score that applied, of course, and then who it was and what particular source it is. So this is the underlying observation, which again is just a correlation search within enterprise security's terminology, a search that is running in the background to generate this observation and take note of it. And then we are then using that risk indicator rule on top of those observations to generate a notable event, which we are then viewing here with all those different risk observations or risk events. That term used interchangeably throughout the day, essentially. So yeah, so we can see that over time, which is great. So that is essentially the biggest key points and how it kind of fits. Now, if we want to view this and go into some details, we can go into the risk analysis page, okay? And this will take us into what's been going on across from a higher perspective. So again, within ES, so similar to that Splunk Security Essentials viewpoint on our risk annotations, we can do it from here. So we've got all the different annotations that might be going on when these risks are happening. We can essentially drill down how our risk framework is working. You know, is it alerting a lot? We've got this particular use case, geographical and probable accesses happening quite a lot, but it's only given 12 points of score, so not particularly very high amounts of score. This one, malicious PowerShell processes, quite a lot of score. Now, is this happening a lot in our environment, or is this particular use case need a little bit of tuning, either reducing the risk score? And most of the tuning processes, when you look at a risk case, is really about tuning the amount of risk to apply. It's not always a case of you just filter out particular known things that occur in the business, because if someone's breaking policy, it's not, maybe it's not a security incident, but you know, they really shouldn't be doing it. It's still something you probably want to bubble up into your risk environment just in case some other things occur with that particular user. So it's just then a case of bringing down the risk. Now, a risk score can be anything that you want, from 0 all the way up to 100, or even more if you want to. But if you're alerting on 100 points of risk, it wouldn't be much point in going any higher than that. But you know, the benefit of being able to do it at 0 is really you're just putting in the risk annotation. You know, you're saying a new user account created. That's not really very risky for your business potentially, but you want to know about it. Or similar, you know, in geographical and probable accesses, not always 100% on it. Its confidence is very low. Potentially will bring that risk score down to 1 or even indeed 0, but we just want to know it's happened. So we can see all these different things. We can see the risk modifiers on this page. So different risk objects, what's been happening to them, and so forth. And we can scroll to the right, so forth. And any pages that you can see in here, we can expand upon any of these dashboards to view in more detail if we need to. So essentially, yeah, how's it actually working? How's it all kind of coming together? Let's have a look. So we're going to go into content management. So in here, we've got, so this is found on the configure, content management, and I filtered down on the correlation searches that are enabled. So these are all the sort of things that are applying to our risk environment in this situation. So we've got a lot of use cases here. The 2 actual risk indicator rules are down here, but let's just take a look at one of the use cases. I think I picked up malicious PowerShell process, and we've seen that already in the environment. So if I come into the correlation search itself, how are we applying the risk? How are we observing this? Okay, so what we're doing is we have a normal correlation search. We are triggering based on the data, so we're looking for the particular data. We then apply a MITRE ATT&CK annotation. So we've got a new section here as of 6.6, I believe, of ES, being able to add in any MITRE ATT&CK or SIS-20 annotations or kill chain annotations or NIST, or indeed any of your own framework that you wish to add in. You can go and add that in. So that could be useful if you work in a very particular industry and you want to be able to correlate risk across the width of the business or something like that, where you know you've got very isolated areas of the business, and if something hits across that whole estate, then that's probably something you want to know about. You know, or you could use it for something that is very much specific to what you want to be, or your industry that you're looking at, regardless of your business, but just your industry. So whatever that might be. You've got your normal sort of time frames, your schedules that's running on, all of the sort of default things you would expect to see, and then our trigger, so we can trigger every time. And then we actually throttle this for an hour, so we don't have multiple events of the same picking up. So usually we'll have an overlap of particular searches to the throttling. So those things can combine up as well to generate the number of events. And then it's really about the adaptive response framework, right? And the adaptive response actions that we take. Now, for this particular one, we do actually create a direct notable, but we also added to the risk analysis page. So we might create a low priority notable. So that might be wanted to be termed directly, but when we get to the full RBA, if we go all the way to the other end, potentially we'll start removing those notables. Okay, so as we progress and tune and build out an RBA strategy for a business, we'll start off keeping the notables, so the process is still there as it was, but we'll start also building in risk, and we'll make sure that when we go from a risk perspective, we're getting at least the same most important information, or the high important security instance that we're seeing normally, and we can measure against that and say that RBA is performing this much better, or and is filtering out a lot of noise that we're just not necessarily dealing with, which would be great. So we also, of course, add risk, and the amount of risk that we add to this particular situation is we put 80 points to the destination field and 80 points to the user field. And these are objects of system and objects of user. Okay, so we've got fields that are in the results of the search, and we added 80 points for this particular type of thing, which you might have seen previously. Now that is your base risk score, and there are risk modifiers that you can apply to change that. Another thing that we can also do is actually tie into threat objects. Now this you saw displayed on the incident review page, but it's also a good way of tying particular different assets, different users together based on the threat objects that might be hitting across them. Okay, so it's another way of kind of piecing the puzzle together, really. So it's also very useful to grab that and highlight that, what's the threat here? What is it that we're actually seeing? Let's take note of it. And also the risk message, taking variables in here, so it makes it a bit more explainable to the user when they start looking at why is this risk being applied? What does it really mean? Well, this particular process happened, and it encoded this particular command, and we can see that being pushed through. Now, I mentioned 80 points as a base risk score. We have what's known as the risk factor editor, and the risk factor editor will essentially alter those scores based on the things that are in play here. So we can use, if it's a particular admin user, we can multiply the risk by 1.5. We can say, okay, well, if the destination is critical, we can multiply the risk by 1.5. So that particular thing, we've got a notable being generated there. We've got 80 points of risk as a base, but if that destination is a priority of critical, we will just multiply it by 1.5, which essentially would mean it will get 120 points of risk. And as we see when we do our risk indicator incident rules, that 120 points will be enough to create an alert. Okay, so we wouldn't necessarily need a notable in that situation. What we would want is the base risk score, and then the risk factors being multiplying that, or in additionalizing it, right? So maybe it's a contractor. We just want to add in extra 5 points of risk if the user is a contractor. Maybe high priority gives 1.25, or low priority reduces it down to 0.2. We get all these different things. Now, none of these are actually enabled here, but you can just go ahead and enable them, or if you want to, you can just go ahead and add additional one, and you can build that out as essentially just some simple logic. This particular field, is it equal to, is it greater than, is it like, all these different kind of comparators to that result, and if it is, what do you want to do about it, essentially. So this is the kind of the one of the ways of tweaking the amount of alerts, or the value of the alerts. And I would definitely be looking at critical, high priority situations, increasing the amount of risk being applied, lower priority, decreasing the amount of risk applied. And these priorities are given from the asset and identity frameworks. Okay, so again, all of ES really coming together to be able to do this RBA approach to security. Now, a risk indicator rule, I'm just going to take a look at both of them really. So there's two that come out of the box. There's one called the risk threshold exceeded over a 24-hour period, and I'm going to break it down. So essentially, here's the search. I'll break it down for you in a moment, and it is creating a notable that's saying 24-hour risk threshold exceeded for this particular risk object, which is the user or system, and there's a drill down and all this sort of great stuff that you would expect to be able to see from it. And you can, of course, add in some next steps, maybe view this particular thing, have a look in, create an investigation, or look in SA investigator if you've got that in play. All these different things here that you can do. So that search, I've broken down here into this new search window. So really what we're doing here is using the risk data model, right? So there is a risk data model called all risk that is generated in the background, taking things from the risk notable index, and we are grabbing all the information that we really want to use to determine how much risk has been applied. for this particular system, and it's running over a 24-hour period here. We're getting rid of the all risk. We're then basically just altering the terminology of the names, and then we're setting a risk threshold of 100 points here. Okay, so we are setting a risk threshold, and then we're just going, well, okay, the sum of all risk calculated risk score, so adding it all over, is called the risk score, and that is by risk object and risk object type. So, you know, user and the user name. So FIORDOR SA essentially. So we're grouping those together, and we're calculating the amount of risk score over 24-hour period, and we're just saying where that calculation is over 100 points, then alert. Nice and simple, real threshold here, to be honest. Nothing particularly too complex at this point, but you know, we're just looking to know when something's hit 100 points of risk. We want to know about it, and we're getting all this nice information about what actually happened. You know, what are the sources that are attributed to this, as in what the use cases that the risk rules that kind of attributed to it, that side of things. And then we're going to get the severity based on that risk score. So if there's a high severity, high number of risks, that increases the severity of deal with it. So that's how that severity is generated at the end. So yeah, nice and easy, really. Just grab a bunch of things from the risk data model by the risk object type, and set a threshold of 100 points. So if you want to tune that and you're getting too many or you're getting too few, you could do a very granular kind of big whacking change over here and change the threshold from 100 points. But really, when you build the risk strategy, you really want to be building it from a goal to, if anything hits 100 points, I want to I want to be told about it. I want a notification about it. I want an alert. And that's really where you want to start from. And if that's not hitting, then potentially your kind of whole strategy should be reduced. But you could alternatively double this to 200 or something else if you're getting too many alerts and they're not quite right. Or, as we'll see from the other search, which is a 7-day search, which is including all the annotations really, which are a much bigger search, but doing very much the same thing. So again, I've just grabbed this correlation search. I've just run it in the search window. This is using, again, the data model for risk. And it's doing a stream stats now in terms of how things are varying over a 7-day period, and then statsing that on top of it and essentially summing the score over that particular thing. So we've got a reset after a whole week. So this is how we do it in a rolling week basis, essentially, with the stream stats. And then, you know, we can calculate the risk duration based on what the last time is for this particular thing the first time. And then we're also getting the maximum tactics, or the value and the number of tactics and the maximum technique count. So how many tactics, how many techniques are happening for a stream of information over a particular risk object. So this is B*1's laptop or desktop. It's a system object. Its last time was in this epoch time. Its minimum time was in this epoch time. Probably all on the same day, because as I said, it's only been up for a day. And these are the MITRE techniques that are involved, and this is the number of tactics, and these are the number of techniques that are here. And there's also the MITRE. We'll be able to then generate all the different, or here are the technique IDs as well, right? So, so we've got that calculation, and now our threshold is quite different, right? So it is where we've got within a week's window. So if anything's over a week, then we're not interested, right? It's a 7-day period search, where we've got at least 2 use cases that have been triggered and at least 2 tactics, okay? Now, this is a different way of alerting. We might be wanting to create a different thing, increasing that, or we might be interested, well, where it's tactic 1566, maybe we need 3 different tactics or 3 different sources to be generating an alert on it. You know, potentially we might have a number of different searches on T1566, and we don't want to count and say, okay, my use case is triggered 5 times on kind of the same tactic. Maybe we want to be a bit more variant on our particular searching perspective, and this is the key piece. This particular line would be the key piece, and how you would then tune that particular use case. And then we basically just get some things to output, really, which is great. So we get the user, the source, all the different fields that we need to output from the particular results, which is good. And then that could be then generating a notable event, which we would then deal with in incident review. So that's kind of an end-to-end piece of how risk the observations. So I'll take you back to just quickly this concept of really going from analytics, correlations, taking observations, which is essentially putting it into a risk index. So you can find this in index equals risk, giving it a risk score, annotating it with the MITRE tactic or technique, and then using a risk incident rule which you just saw to create an alert. Now, if you're interested in getting this in your environment, what I can recommend, although I wrote it, so I suppose recommending it is probably just showing off, is there's a couple of different blogs about getting started with risk-based alerting. So RBA blog part 1, this is really how we can set a framework up to do RBA, how we decide what scores we want to be putting into place, how we can weight all the different risk rules. And then a second part on, what's the best way to tune this afterwards, right? So putting it in place is great, but then we maybe want to think about tuning it. So there's a 2-part blog series there, which you can see on somerfordassociates.com blog, which should get you started, or of course reach out to us and we can go into a more one-to-one conversation. But other than that, I thank you all for your time. It's been a fairly brief webinar. Hopefully that gives you a bit more time back. Again, if you have any questions, I'll stay around and answer any questions. If not, please jump off and enjoy the rest of your day.